The VR Report podcast with David Jean O.
Hey, Kharis, welcome to the VR Report, my man.
Hi, David. It's great to be here.
Yeah, cool. Hey, Kharis, for the audience, you want to give a brief intro of your origin story?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Kharis O'Connell. I am currently the head of UX at a small startup called Bootloader Studio, based out of Vietnam. But my history is really the last sort of 15 years or so in spatial computing, designing within that medium for companies such as Nokia back in the day, the very, very earliest AR sort of experiences, and then through Meta and Google and Amazon and so on. So it's kind of big company tech, seeing behind the curtain, small, scrappy startups, and everything in between. But it's always to do with the future of computing for me. That's the thing that drives me.
That's cool, Kharis. And then right now, from when we discussed, you moved out to the desert. Tell me about why that even happened.
Yeah, so I left the Bay Area earlier this year and moved out to the Mojave Desert. Not the most hospitable place in the world you could move, but as someone who often seeks out and a little bit of danger, I like going off-road and camping and so on. I felt it was like a natural evolution of those traits in my life. Bit different for my wife and kids. It's beautiful out here. It takes me, an hour and a half to get to the nearest big city. And to get to LA is just under 2 hours. So I kind of get the benefits of being close enough to, the kind of metropolis culture, while also still, being in the middle of nowhere and looking at Sierra Nevada and Death Valley and all of this. So for me, it's great.
That's fantastic. So, you work in technology, invest in it day in and day out, but for your personal time, you like to be out in the desert, be out in the nature. And, I think that's really interesting that you live that polarity. That's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's good you mentioned that, because I think that was something I wanted to really double down on after spending, so much of my life in this ultra deep area of technology with stuff on my face all the time, devices, all kinds of things, seeing all these different things. And I really craved that kind of raw lack of connectivity and a kind of back to nature thing to sort of balance it out. So I'm not completely obsessed with no escape. So
cool. That's awesome. And talking about the topic for here today, the VR report, we talk about mixed reality, virtual reality, and augmented reality, everything in between X and R. And in terms of mixed reality today, that's the hot topic. You actually wrote the book on designing for mixed reality several years ago, before even mixed reality became, part of the lexicon. I'd like for you to explain to our audience your understanding of mixed reality and elaborate on how it stands out from other immersive technologies.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I started writing the book in 2015, I was approached by O'Reilly at the time, and they were like, hey, there's this emerging medium, and, do you want to talk to us? And then, when they suggested writing a book, it was a bit weird because, the first thing I think a lot of potential authors do is go look around for other books on the same topic to see, let's see what other people have said about it. And I found that I couldn't find anything. So it was a bit of a Wild West. This was the days of the DK1 and, the Meta 1 AR headset. And I think the Vive had just come out. So it was really early. Everything was tethered. Everything was a lot of hassle to make it work. But I tried to just come at this with a kind of puristic design angle and just say, hey, one day this will become the norm for design. And so why not kind of try and get ahead and look at what challenges there's going to be from a design perspective, not looking at the engineering, but purely how will people interact with this class of device or devices going forward? And so that in itself was enough to me to just sort of want to jump in with both feet and write this thing. even though, I have no reference particularly to say whether it would be right or wrong what I was writing. So, and of course, now the book has aged somewhat. We're not in DK1 era anymore. So, when I go back and look at it, I'm like, oh, yeah, okay, that's kind of like no longer a problem, or oh, that is, something that continues to be a problem, etc. But, if I was to do it again, it would probably keep a similar theme. But, the devices and the class of devices have moved on so dramatically since those days. So it's a lot easier now, I think.
How does the historical context of computing, because you also spent time at Nokia, influence the modern mixed reality experiences of today? What's the context there?
Yeah, I guess. I always personally, like I said, looked at spatial computing as the natural evolution of all computing interfaces. It was like, okay, we started off with the keyboard, the mouse, the terminal. We moved through these different devices. Then we ended up with touch screens, touching through glass, manipulating through glass. That started to kind of have a direct connection to the objects that we're manipulating with the GUI. And then taking that further with spatial computing, mixed reality, the leap with that is the essentially the z-axis, which never existed before really in computing. You always have to care about the resolution of the screen, the size of it, and that was it. That was kind of your design canvas. It's like you lay these buttons and boxes and arrows all over the place, and then you just, you manipulate those. But with the addition of the z-axis and the idea of not understanding where the actor or the user is in any given scene, so you could be behind the UI or the UI is attached to a wall or whatever, this brought up all these different kind of challenges of context and how do you infer what you see in a UI to what's going on around that UI in the real world, say in AR. And I think that, that's the connection to the computers that we have today. They've largely been kind of dumb, even with Alexa and Google Assistant and Siri and so on. It's still been a kind of weird call and response system where, I'm either like hammering mechanical keys with my fingers like the old days and punching in syntax and waiting for some result, or I'm, trying to speak robotically into a microphone and be like, find me the blah, blah, blah. But with the idea of like the computer disappearing and you have all these sensors, suddenly the world can be your interface. So you should understand what's going on around you. So you don't need to have so much contextual kind of information that pads around the central query. So I think that's something that I find really, really quite interesting about the medium and just, the design for in this area going forward. So yeah, that's how I think of it right now.
Kharis, that's really cool. You're an OG in this space in terms of this new modern era of what we call virtual reality, the last decade. You have a very unique approach because you've worked at some of the top companies, really focusing on these emerging technologies. But designing for mixed reality is totally different than the 2D spaces, like you had mentioned. First of all, you are the viewer, you are the camera. So then you have to design for those type of affordances. But what are some of your top 3 things as a designer that any designer going into XR for spatial computing differ from 2D? What are those 3 key differences for someone who's designing in this space that they should think about when they're designing for spatial? What are those 3 main things that you think they should know?
I think one of them, the biggest one I often come back to, is that in every prior medium, in some way, just like directing a film, you're able to somewhat control the path that a user goes down, right? So they click a button, it moves to the next screen, it moves to the next screen, and so on and so forth. And designers obviously spend a long time crafting user journeys. So they're like, oh yeah, they click here, see this, then they'll offer 3 options, and then they go off to these other things. Everything is very, very structured. But in a world, like I mentioned, where you're not quite sure of the situation and the environment where, X may be happening, or this thing might, the user might want to do this thing right now. I think that's what makes it something that's very, very different. I've often said you cannot direct really inside of this medium effectively, but you can't create a singular narrative that you know is going to exist from start to finish. What happens is you can start something, but there is so many potential permutations depending on, where the user is at that given time, the situation at that given time, like what they're looking at, whether it's indoor, outdoor, bright light, no light. It's even hard to design the interface to be legible at given distances. Like, is it near me? Is it far away from me? Am I looking at it from a distance now because I haven't stepped away? How is that going to work? And so I think that all these kind of challenges make it a very, very different medium to any medium that's kind of come before it. I think that, when I look back now at designing, obviously, at Nokia, for mobile, and I think about all of the challenges that were there and all the books you had to read, the best practices, Donald Norman, Jacob Nielsen, etc. A lot of those things just don't really apply in the same way anymore in this world, because it's very, very in the moment. It's very, very kind of declarative user interfaces, situationally relevant, and only temporarily available. So that makes it very difficult to actually, because a lot of this still has to convert back down to 2D to share often with other designers or to document. And so even the documentation process, the Figmas and so on of the world that have been such a big hit, struggle more in this medium where it's kind of more like a tree structure where any branch could happen at any given moment, and it's more of a set of if this then that statements to how you design, rather than a kind of beautifully logical flow from like start to finish. So I think that's something, again, it's a lot of designers find it incredibly challenging and frustrating as a medium. They're like, why can't I just, knock it out, kind of thing. And I think that misses the point of what the freedom of the medium will give you, essentially. Because if all we're going to do is put the interfaces that we have today floating in front of our face, we tap in on virtual buttons, it's like, well, I'll just stick to this because, it works, does the same thing. So, like, what's the point? So I think that that's an evolutionary path that we have to go down altogether. To spatialization.
Yeah, I think that was fantastic. I think the closest parallels in terms of designing for spatial, like you had really delved deep into, is that it's really a change in medium of how you're designing those type of affordances.
Yeah.
I had a great conversation with Don Carson, who's a Disney Imagineer, who's also responsible for Walkabout Golf, one of my favorite VR games to socialize and hang out with friends. But he used his background at Disney, where even as an Imagineer, you're always thinking of the user's experience, even so much so when they're even designing the dioramas of, theme park rides. They're making sure that when they review the designs, they actually take these miniatures and see them at eye level of where the viewer would be at the theme park.
Yes.
So I think that's really cool, where spatial is now all of these things, that one extra dimension. And there are some tools that are coming out to help designers develop for 3D spaces. There's like Bezel, there's also Shapes XR.
Yeah.
Have you used any of these tools outside of Figma? Of course, like you had mentioned that 2D paradigm where there's a shift there. Have you used some of these 3D tools in your experience?
Yeah, I've used Shapes XR. I used that back early in the day. I think they were actually one of Meta's early customers, if I'm not mistaken.
They were, yeah.
And I'm a fan of all these new attempts to design inside of the medium, but I also one of the most effective ways of understanding that kind of how it will feel. I used to call it like improvisational theatre almost, where you would have a design team and you clear a physical space. And what you would do is you would talk and act out what's happening in front of you. And you might hold up, a piece of cardboard that's got, what the UI might be, and you might put it away from you or get someone to hold it. And the idea was that everybody could kind of see you and the things going on, and you wording like what's meant to happen. But they'd be able to kind of move around this theatre almost and see it from all angles to see the edge cases. Like, oh, yeah, actually, that's not going to work if if you're facing this way and that actually ends up being anchored over here, then you might miss a pop-up dialogue or whatever it is. So that's something in itself that I've found interesting, is like the ShapesXR is doing it in the headset and manipulating objects and kind of putting them where you want them to be and attaching behaviors. But I also think it's interesting in a group setting, as often design is done in a team, is to actually just act these things out. You don't need too much detail in the early stages. And in some way, you want to see how socially weird it looks from the outside as well. So there's a bit of that, because I think that's something we don't have to think about with this. No one thinks designing for this, like, what are you going to look like when you're pressing buttons? But of course, if you're in a headset and you're like, oh, I'm walking around like this, it's like, whoa, like that just, that's not great. So yeah, these new tools that are emerging, though, are really exciting. So I'm always up for trying these things, of course.
Yeah, I think in terms of designing for XR, using the tools that are appropriate, I think is very important. But you had a really exciting time and a unique perspective working at Google, trying to figure out how a spatial OS would even help users interact with technology. Can you kind of share your experience there with designing for an OS in spatial, and what it took, and what were you trying to accomplish? What were some of the things that you learned that might be beneficial for other developers?
Yeah, I mean, Google was an interesting time. So I left Meta and I joined Google. They contacted me and said, hey, do you want to come on board and lead this kind of stealth? They wouldn't tell me what it was, stealth thing. I kind of had an idea of what they were trying to do. But when I got there, one of the things that I think I first noticed was the legacy of Daydream, right? They were early with cardboard. Google was had a lot of knowledge already. I mean, I was blown away, to be honest, the first year of being there at just what I saw, because it was so above and beyond what I thought they were at. Both from a hardware perspective, capabilities, but also from a knowledge perspective on a spatial operating system. I think what was interesting most at that time was there was a couple of things going on. There was an openness to new ideas, which was actively trying to avoid the Google Glass history. So, as we all know, Google Glass was a big kind of public failure for Google, and the ghost of Glass kind of walked the corridors of the AR research group. So everybody who'd been at Google for a long time was always kind of like, oh, we're Google Glass, let's not talk about that. And I felt like it was this weight on everyone's shoulders. That meant that everyone was kind of open for brand new ideas. They were like, there is no sacred cows. Let's try and make a spatial interface, a spatial operating system. And I think the thing that stood out the most for me at Google was the passion in the space, which I'd never, and even since then, to be quite frank, I've never seen the amount of people who were so driven to discover this future, this spatial future. But I think, and this is no secret for Google, is that Google notoriously abandons things pretty sort of mercilessly if it doesn't hit the numbers or it doesn't look like it's going to be a massive hit out the box. And of course, as we know with this medium, it's a slow burning medium, and it's not like a kind of overnight success story. And that's where I think that I saw a lot of incredible hardware and a lot of incredible prototypes, a lot of incredible ideas that we designed and that worked for all intents and purposes, kind of start to just be like, I don't think we're going to go there. So that was a bit of the flip side of the freedom and the excitement in Google and the knowledge base that was there, because people had come from all over the place, to Google. There was legends like Kurt Ackerley. He was from Silicon Graphics International. He was kind of one of the originators of computer graphics, and he'd sit next to me in the unmarked building, and I felt like I was among all these people who could change the world, but one by one, it just ended up being quashed and being stopped, and like, oh, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. So it was a really tough time for me because I'd seen such promise and I'd seen such things that could have given Apple easily a run for the money, easily, and just be kind of put to bed. And so that was a shame. But I met incredible people that went on to join Apple and various other companies, Meta and so on, afterwards. So it's not all kind of bad news, but I think Google is just not the best company at sticking to things. That's the takeaway.
Yeah, or almost it's like an R&D project to, like you said, if it hits, it's great, but Google has to invest in new technologies like this. And, one thing I wanted to ask you when you had joined when you had joined Google was that we were working together at Meta, and, you were the shining beacon talking about spatial workspace for Meta. And that was a revolutionary thing that we were doing at MetaView, where we even won an AWE award. I'm not going to do it justice as you will. Can you talk about workspace for MetaView? And I wanted to know how that influenced you at Google and the operating system there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good reminder, David, because I think one of the things I've learned over the last years is, particularly with Meta, the original Meta, OG, was how advanced in some ways it really was. Even though the technology was not perfect, we know this. The sensors weren't perfect. There was a lot of issues with latency and so on. But if you think about the conceptual side of it, and you think about AWE, I just, not to sidetrack, but I mentioned just actually reasonably briefly to somebody about, when we had the phone and you could pull things out of the phone into space and put them back in the phone. And they're like, what? How did you do this? And it's like, there were things we were doing that in some ways, if Apple would show this, minds would be melting from seeing this. But anyway, I think that the thing that I took from Meta that I took to Google on the workspace side was that number one, you're always going to have the issue of like screen resolution, because obviously if you try to pop up a screen just like a computer monitor screen, the resolution is often a lot lower. There's more eye fatigue. There's more, you've got more issues with motion sickness and so on and so forth if the tracking systems and the slams and time of flight is not working as well as it should, especially as well as it didn't do, back then. Google had much more powerful hardware than we'd ever had, and arguably to date, it's the most powerful hardware I've ever seen, including the Vision Pro. And I think that gave me a good hope that a lot of the challenges of making a workspace work in the real life and make it be a tool, not a gimmick, especially with Google integration and the idea of the cloud and all the stuff that Google could do very, very well, the software side. I felt like it was very, very close to being real, that kind of early vision that we had at Meta, which arguably may never have happened, is something Google was like in their wheelhouse. They were like, oh yeah, we can do this, and at scale as well. So that made it double as hard when, of course, do it and shut it down. So yeah, that was kind of another thing I had to like bury deep inside of me of like, why is it so hard to do these things? So yeah, that was a learning for sure.
In terms of understanding how operating systems work, it's really about getting that information as quickly as possible so that user can then process it almost in real time to figure out what to do next, right?
Yes.
Whether to do context switching to different views,
yes,
but you also have to have understanding of 3D space. Your work at Google with this OS, does that live on today? Like what's happened now? I mean, because Google has shown off so much stuff in the last 2 years and made an announcement with a partnership with Samsung. What do you think the future holds for Google and AR?
Google is an unabashed kind of fast follow company, right? And there's one company that Google really follows fast, and that's Apple. So I think Meta and others in the AR VR space, it's not something Google really cares about. But when Apple does something, then they sit up. They're like, we have to be aware that, our closest rival is doing, X. And so we have to do something. I think that there was a bunch of unfortunate, how can I say, misdirections in Google over the last few years. These are well documented out there as well. And this resulted in a lot of different attempts at operating systems and even acquisitions. Google acquired North back in the day because they kind of pivoted away from immersive. I will say that I remember the actual conversation I had at that time saying, hey, we need to keep on the sort of immersive MR path. And I was told kind of unequivocally that, Google, they told me and said, hey, Apple's never going to do immersive stuff. They're going to do lightweight, teeny tiny glasses first. And I was like, no, they're not. They didn't listen. And then, of course, they bought North and so on. And then there's been a bunch of backpedaling going on. There's been a bunch of like, oh, actually, let's stop doing that now as well. Oh, quickly, let's stop doing this. I think the Samsung partnership is logical because the weakness, the Achilles heel of Google has always been on the hardware side, right? Building up that hardware division and the sheer amount of R&D dollars that Google has spent over the years on headsets and prototypes, I think they grew weary of handling the whole thing themselves. So now I think there's more chance that Samsung kind of picks up the hardware and does the fast follow. And then Google kind of comes along with, hey, we've got Android, a spatial version of Android that you can like drop on this thing and you'll get access to the Play Store and all the rest of the goodness. And you don't need to worry, Samsung, about that side of things. So I think that the partnership, maybe they found the happy place, Google, where it's like just enough risk, just enough reward. After going through this tumultuous, like last 10 years since Google Glass, which has been, like I mentioned, a tough time for Google in total.
Sure. Now let's jump forward to your position at Amazon as the head of futures design. We never even synced up after you joined Amazon, but I'd like you to kind of give a walkthrough of your time there, what you were working on, what you learned, and just share with the audience of your experience there.
Yeah, I mean, Amazon, it was a very different beast to Google, unsurprisingly. And I think one of the things to add context to that was that, after all the things at Google and after being in, mixed reality for such a long time and seeing so many things, either not make it like Meta and Google and so on, I was feeling pretty like, oh, I need to broaden my horizons. So I was still very, very much interested in the future of spatial computing. But I also, and this is funnily enough, while I was at Google, I joined a group inside Google called R&D for the Built Environment. It was an internal steering committee that was looking at how humans would want to work and live in the future. This included spatial computing, immersive computing as a core component. And that was my part within this operational sort of secret group inside of Google, where our customer was Sundar. He was the only one who got those sort of findings. So when I went to Amazon, I wanted to double down a bit more on a broader understanding of what it means to design the future. So instead of seeing it through kind of, pardon the pun, but like rose-tinted glasses, I wanted to be like, it's not just about people wearing headsets in the future. It's like, where are they going to wear their headsets? What's going to power the headsets of the future? Are people going to be living more remote work in the future? What does that mean for the systems that support it? And I think that the idea of futures for Amazon was really trying to, our customer was essentially the executive team. So it was Dave Limp and Andy Jassy was our customers. And that was to show them glimpses of things that didn't yet exist inside of Amazon. So it wasn't like, here's a new Amazon Echo, or like, oh, what do you think of this Amazon product? It was more all-encompassing scenarios of oh, here's a scenario of the future of a certain demographic, and they're using this, that, and the other technologies, and they're powered by the sun or alternative energy, alternative resource management. And I think Amazon was trying to see where would they fit in that future. Is there a business model there for Amazon? Because, you know, it's one of the world's largest companies. It's definitely the largest logistics company in the world. And so with that immense amount of power behind them, they were like, we can actually like deliver and change the world if we want to. We've just got to decide what is it that we want to do, you know, in the next 10, 15 years, because everything was like 10, 15 years out. So that's what Futures Group was. It was a very unique and special group inside of Amazon that kind of ran to its own, I guess, tempo and, you know, to its own sort of initiatives. It wasn't part of, you know, Alexa or Echo or any of the kind of internal divisions inside of Amazon. But of course, the flip side being that when the economy started to struggle, Amazon did as Amazon, you know, does, and just say, okay, anything that's not a profit center, just stop. And so all of the further future possibilities were kind of wound down. They were like, okay, you know, we're not focusing on any of that stuff anymore. So for me, it was very much like, okay, then I guess, you know, I don't want to work on Echo or Alexa or, you know, even their Echo Frames glasses.
Right. Because, you know, Amazon invested heavily into like the Echo Frames, for example. They didn't have a visual component, but they did have Assistant, which is kind of groundbreaking, that you can walk around with your Assistant.
That's right.
But then at this Futures Group, you weren't putting some of the ecosystem that was already put forth, but it was more like, hey, what's happening for the future of Amazon? How do we fit in there? Maybe with AWS, maybe even with this e-commerce portion. Okay, cool. That's awesome.
It was across the entire company. I mean, of course, we were trying to use, wherever possible, using things that we have or are on the roadmap, but we weren't bound by, for example, Echo Frames. You know, we could go further and say, well, what about if it did have displays in it and it was more like a proper immersive headset? And what if that ended up being what the kids want to wear in 10 years from now? What would that look like for us? And so, you know, designing those future glasses and headsets and environments and all the things in between and how AWS would work in it and so on. And so that was there. We were there to try and join the dots between.
That's super cool. Now coming from, you know, the original MetaView, Amazon, Google, what is your thoughts on interfaces of where the current industry stands today? And where can it improve upon? Do you like the interfaces in XR today? And what do you think is most important to tackle and to fix?
I mean, yeah, that's a good question because I've never been a fan, although I understand, and I'll give some context. I've never been a fan of like taking what we have here, you know, wholesale and kind of just like, whoop, stick it on your face.
Yeah, take your mobile phone and just stick it on your face.
We had a term for this in Google. It was called SWAF, smartwatch on face. And it's kind of a derogatory term that people used internally. It was like, oh, did you see that SWAF concept? And everyone's like, yeah, you know, oh my God, it's terrible. I think there was this idea, and that was partially, remember, that was from Glass, because Glass notifications popping up on face. So there was an understanding of like, if the future is just, you know, popping up, you have 3 messages, or, you know, send a quick SMS to David or something like this, that there's not enough value there for people to wear these kinds of class of devices. So it has to be more than that, it has to do more than that. And that's problematic because then it means it's more expensive, more complex. But I mean, one of the things that we did at Meta, which obviously, as you probably remember, David, was a bone of discussion and contention within, was the kind of skeuomorphic aspects of 3D. So whereas the original Meta was like, make everything visually literal. So like, you know, if you have a toggle button like on off, make it visually have a mechanical action that's like, you can see it on off. I know our dear CEO at the time, Marone, is very, very strong on this. But in hindsight, I can see now, even though we went, I think, too far in some ways with it, there is an element of that that rings true going forward. And that is the idea of priors and affordances. So, there's not a lot of priors and affordances that make sense in a 3D context when you've just got flat buttons and, a green button for yes and a red button for no and so on. And you're tapping these buttons in the air, floating all the air. I think that the UIs of the moment, and it goes the same for the Vision Pro, are designed a little bit like the first iPhone, which was trying to drag people from their filofaxes to buying phones. So it was heavily skeuomorphic, as you remember, with like rich Corinthian leather-bound calendar apps.
That's right.
And all of this was meant to have a sense of familiarity to get you across into this new world and feel comfortable using it so that then the UI could start to modernize and shift. I see a similar thing now with interfaces in MR. I think the journey has to be faster though, because the need for newness is there much more with, you got to remember generationally, a lot of people have grown up, watching Ready Player One and have seen all these, Lawnmower Man and all the rest of it in between, sci-fi and so on. And they have a certain expectation about the future. So if you kind of dumb it down and go, well, let's give you just, floating notifications again, there's a bit of a kind of meh attitude. It's like, oh, who cares? Like, wow me. Like, where's the pizzazz? Where's the future? And I think that this is going to be something that, even for Apple and for everyone in between, if we dwell too long in floating panels of boxes and buttons, then we'll miss the whole point of the transition to the medium. We'll just end up replicating, the smartwatch on the face. And I think that's fine to start, but we've got to quickly go into new, exciting methods of interaction. And I think as long as it follows more natural priors, then there's no need to sort of over-explain, because you think about any tutorials are needed in games to explain UI. If you think about modern interfaces, it's always a worry for me where it's like, oh, before you can play this game, you need to go through the tutorial where it's got an overlay that points to all the buttons and arrows and explains what all of it does. And then when that kind of overlay goes away, you're like, wait, what was it again? Like, I have no idea what these abstract things do. Let me just go back and try it again. And I think that points to this idea that it's fine for a game if you're invested in it, but you'll go through the effort. But for a lot of people who just want to pick these things up and experience this new paradigm, it needs to be much more clear with its sort of visual understanding within the medium, so you can look at something and kind of understand its behavior and how you're meant to interact with it. So I think that's something that, is just a natural part of what we have to go through to get to the place where it's ubiquitous and people are not scratching their head going, how does this, I don't understand it. I mean, that happens all the time at Meta. It's like, this is cool, but like, how does it, what am I meant to do?
Right.
These things are the modern challenge of the medium, because it is a big leap. It's a giant leap in many ways. So, yeah.
100%. I think for people that are new to this industry, not only is there a new way of understanding how this information gets portrayed in 3 dimensions, but there's a lot of substantial benefits of mixed reality. What do you think the benefits are for the end user when you provide the mixing of virtual and real world? What does that mean for end users?
Well, I think if you do it well, what it does is it definitely replaces everything that you've had today. And if you think about all the junk we carry around with us, pockets, watches on wrists, pockets with a phone in, a bag with a laptop, a desktop machine when you get home, and everything has to be synced and charged. Charging is the modern, sort of issue that we have to deal with all the time. I think if you do it correctly and you have this mixed reality future, people will understand that you can have so much richer understanding of your real world environment. So you can query the real world in a way and a way of expressing it that it was not really possible or practical before. For example, one of the things that we did at Google, which was really a big sort of hit, was, Nest. We all know what the Nest is, little display with just, the numbers of the temperature on. And yes, you can dial through the menu and so on. But, what if you wanted to see the week's, power usage on average? Then you could look at the Nest and then it would just put it up all around the Nest on the wall. And suddenly you'd have this temporal display that's not taking over your house. You can see it. It's useful for you. I get an insight that is not possible through the little UI, and I don't want to be fishing around in my pocket and opening an app, finding the right app, or getting my watch and scrolling it. I can just say, hey, show me look at the Nest and say, hey, show me the last week's data usage, plot the graph of the wall. Maybe I can touch it and touch points on the wall, and then it'll show me more information. It's a very visually rich and expressive way of understanding the world around you. Or, I know that back at Meta, one of Marone, the CEO's favorite use cases, which I think was great, was, the ability to walk around a forest, look at a flower and just say, hey, what is this? And then it pops up what it is. And it shows the genius. And it's like, oh, there's others around that are like this. And if you think about how it's done today, it's like, oh, quick, there's a flower. Let me find the app that I take the picture with, click, wait for the query to go up, analyze the picture. Then the picture comes back, but it doesn't know what I want to know yet. So I better start typing in, like, what is it that I actually want to know? And there's a whole set of sort of chunked sequences to get the answer you want. And in the end, you end up with a web page of results. And you have to work out, which one makes the most sense for the context that you were just trying to find out, based on the shape of the petals of the flower or whatever. So I think mixed reality adds a certain magic to the world. So I can see it helping educate people. I can see it becoming rich learning environments for children, for kids. We know that this is very effective to teach people as a medium. Oculus did this a long time ago, did a bunch of studies with kids and showed them, things inside of the VR and then quiz them. And they do much better than the kids reading the books in these quizzes. And I think we'll transition into a different form of relationship with the world around us. And that for me is the point. It's not to disappear from the world and say, oh, it's all burning, climate change, so I'm just going to hide in the corner and live in my own little world. I think what's interesting about mixed reality is it doesn't take away the real world. If anything, it can actually inform you about what's going on in the real world around you and somehow make you more of an active participant in the world, while at the same time staying out of the way when you don't need it, right? It's not about filling your world with advertisements as much as advertisement people would like.
Those are beautiful examples. You touched on so much there. I think the metaphor of being able to learn about any object in the world in augmenting that is very useful. That example you had with plants in a forest. The other example that you touched upon was Nest and your watch to extend the screen instead of being able to look at a small UI. You're able to blow that up as big as you want. There's going to be a trend now with more body-worn computing. You probably saw the Human demo. One of the founders of the iPhone, he also created this new interface called Human. There's going to be now more body-worn computing devices. And there's a lot of implications of that with mixed reality. You touched upon some, which is like augmenting the screen and having that. Where else do you see wearables being enhanced by mixed reality?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, one of the things I think there's going to be the ongoing challenge, the same for Humane, and it's also for Apple Vision Pro and everything else, is the sun. So it's okay if you live in a place with no sun, but for the most part, I live in a place with a lot of sun. And I think that a lot of the visualization aspects of the wearables struggle in bright sunlight, right? You can't see, through your mixed reality glasses or AR glasses, you struggle with the brightness of the real world. That's why we wear sunglasses often in bright sunlight. But also, like Humane uses a projector system, which is going to struggle in bright sunlight to fight against the
Mm-hmm.
sun. So I think that wearables will go through different kinds of transitions. I think that the visualization layer is most effective when it's nearest to your eye, because then you've got less issues of light seeping in between, let's say. Now, whether that's like closed in or making sure that light doesn't seep in, or you've got like digital pass through like the Vision Pro, I think these are ways of dealing with it. Not perfect by any means, but I think that they're ways of dealing with these things. But the other wearables, I think, are going to become more like different insights into your physiology and your condition. It's something
That's
that I
cool.
did at Amazon. I worked on Halo, which was used tone of voice analysis. So it would listen to not your words. It wasn't like analyzing your words and what you were saying. It was trying to pick up, and it did it very successfully actually, on like, are you sounding tense or angry? Or are there's this whole science obviously behind this, real science around just the tonalities are an indication of your mental state, not the words themselves. And so we would give you insights into your kind of mental health situation at Halo. That was also, had its own issues, because it was like, oh, but Amazon is listening to me, or Jeff Bezos is listening to me, and Jeff was not listening to you. But anyway, it's like a lot of people are worried about having all these sensors and all these cameras and all these things looking at them, even with the Vision Pro has, backward facing cameras to look at your eyes for eye tracking and so on, and look at your facial kind of interface area. And so there's all these different things that I think will be challenges as well as people adopt more and more of these systems. But I do also want to say that, wearables is one part of it. The other part is the other sensors in the house. Because right now you have to put a UI on a sensor for it to be read. And so what this will allow is sensors to essentially disappear into the walls. Like in the future, you may buy, little pucks that don't have anything on them whatsoever, that are given to builders when they build the house, and they put them in the walls. And all they do is send sensory data back to any of the devices that you use for visualization, so that you can call up at any moment the kind of interface that you want to interact with, but you don't have to have persistent screens or LED, displays all over the place. You can have a very serene, very calm environment, but only on demand can it kind of light up. So I think that's a much healthier sort of understanding. Same goes with wearables. Maybe the Apple Watch of the future won't have a screen on it at all, because they'll be like, you don't need it if you've got the Vision Pro, right? So you just want something that measures your heartbeat or your pulse oxidation and so on. So this is where it gets exciting for me, because it gets more subtle, it gets more humanistic. It's less people staring at blue screens all the time. And I think that is a much healthier sort of society in many ways.
That's cool. So what you're saying is that with the future of mixed reality, a lot of the technology that we see will go away because it's embedded and it's almost inferior, or maybe, hidden sensors in the walls, heartbeat rating from your watch. But then how you visualize all of this is through your headset when they become more affordable, more lightweight, more comfortable to wear all day.
Yeah.
That's cool. I think especially for mixed reality, you mentioned the building and having sensors. AEC, or architecture, engineering, construction, is a prime
Absolutely.
industry use case where I want to visualize the building before I actually put people into it or spend money on this building. Construction, you can probably see some, visualizations. What if we did this or that, and then actually see the visualization take place. So you see in architecture, in engineering, construction, mixed reality, I really think that's a huge problem solver for that industry. What other industries do you think are going to be disrupted with mixed reality today?
If you think about to take the sensor discussion we were just having, I can imagine a future where you swallow these sensors, and then you go to the doctor, and the doctor looks at you with their headset on, and they're like, just stand there and then it brings up all the charts around you, and it's showing blood flow, or it's showing, your systolic average or whatever. And you've not got all these things you have to put on and pump up and be like, try all these things. It's just like, great, the patient's here. I get a good understanding of the kind of, how the, so to speak, the engine is running inside of you. And I think it's less invasive in many ways. So I think that's one thing, is medical industry is going to be really opened up. And of course, it was the same at Meta. One of our main, as you remember, main interested industries was the medical industry. We worked with Stanford at the time. You remember, they had the headsets for understanding surgery and so on. So there's definitely links there. I think that it's going to kind of change a lot of industries where you have to gain an insight into something. So you could even imagine, take it further and be like car manufacturers have a OBD interface that's plugged in, and then the mechanics who work for Toyota, let's say, they can open the hood and look at the engine, and it's showing like this is a block. And then instead of, paying for them to go, I don't know, let me just spend a few hours taking things apart and having a look, there may be ways to gain this kind of insight through this fusion, like sensor fusion, so to speak, between, what's there in the real world, and then the ability to kind of bring up all the information about it that you need, and in a very private way. So again, it's something that can keep the world kind of semi-private. It's not like I'm broadcasting these things to all and sundry, but if you combine security attributes with that, which obviously would be there, you have very, very private ways that only certain people get to see certain kinds of information. And I think it's going to be the same with people with headsets looking at each other in the future as well. So you're going to have a lot of I guess, the easiest way to say it is like, the kind of cosplay sort of stuff going on, because they're already doing it in Snap and, dressing up and, wearing all different kinds of costumes. It's inevitable. This is going to be a huge part of mixed reality, because you can identify visually as whatever you want to be. And then, anyone in the vicinity with the headset will look at you and they will see you as a dragon, or they will see you as whatever it is you want to manifest. It becomes really kind of a rich artistic expression medium for young people in the future. Whereas right now, again, they've got to go, hey, look, check this out. Look at this. And you've got to share the phone or send a picture to everyone. And in the future, you'll all be sitting around going, how great do we look? Don't we look amazing? And it's like, whoa, like that's an amazing costume. So I think expressiveness, artistry, science, they're all going to be like tremendously impacted by this technology as it starts to gain more of a sort of traditional foothold and starts to replace the devices that we have today.
That's super cool. I think the things you mentioned regarding societal impact of how people want to identify themselves or portray themselves to the world, I think that check mark is checked. I think that's really cool. I think there's also things in terms of societal impact. I have a theory that with generative AI and understanding, minute facial expressions, technically the AI can know when you're lying, right? So that's also a societal thing that we'll have to address. What if people can't lie in the future, right? Is that good for society? Is that bad? I don't know. It can go both ways depending on if you're being lied to or you're the one lying, right? But how else do you envision near future impact of mixed reality on society, especially considering user interactions and experience?
I mean, it is definitely a double-edged sword, right? We've been through the sort of happy valley of it, but there's clearly a darker place as well. And that is something that I have, been aware of through my entire career. I even wrote in the book that I did for there was one section in it where I talked about a future, and it's funny actually the story behind it. And all it does is talk about a future where everyone's wearing these devices. You're on a public transport bus or something. It's set in the near future, and people have subscribed to kind of choose your own adventure type stories. And then essentially what's happening is people are hallucinating. It's a kind of like accepted hallucination, right? Because if you can overlay people and objects in the real world and imbibe them to become whatever it is, then at some point your idea of what reality is starts to sort of fall apart, or at least what you think of as reality traditionally, and becomes more like people, who are like, crazy hallucinating drug takers who are like chasing invisible things down the road. And so in my chapter, there's like a guy on a bus staring at another person because he thinks it's a character in the adventure series, and he freaks out, shouts at the guy. The guy's like, I have no idea what's going on. He gets up, runs off the bus. You get off the bus, there's two people running down the street screaming. There's like all kinds of stuff going on all over the place where people are in their own subscribed adventure, so to speak. And I think that is something that we do have to be mindful of. Because, of course, people can play games, and as they do today. This isn't a video game nasties kind of warning, but it's like the difference was before is you could always box in reality into the device that you're holding. So, if you look outside the periphery of your iPad or your games console, it's like, oh yeah, right, it's the real world. Of course, that's not real. This is real around me. But in a mixed reality world, it's going to become incredibly difficult, especially with graphics getting better, everything becoming more photorealistic, deep fakes, AI, etc. It's like jump forward 10 years and the world may be a really difficult place for the human eye and the human ear to ascertain what's real and what's not anymore. Where you're like, oh, I don't know what's going on anymore, really. And that could actually trigger a situation where people start taking the headsets off, to trust each other. They're like, as a trust giving thing, it's like, it's like taking my sword off or something, we both gang tools as warriors in respectfulness. We don't mean
Right.
harm. And I feel like there may be where you're like, look, David, hey, take this off, and you're like, I take it off. We see each other now. Like, I trust what I see now from your face. You trust what I see from your face. Conversely, I think people will bend those rules. I've already seen a bunch of, visual disruptors that people are selling now, like masks that have certain attributes that throw off like computer vision systems. So it's very difficult to track faces. It's very difficult to analyze visually the body shape. If you wear a certain, like, I can't remember, there was a guy wearing a top that was covered in sheep or something that was like done in all these like very natural colors, and it was all collage, and it looked awful, of course. But the CV systems just look, it's like man. He sees him, and it's like a sheep. I don't know. It's a sky sheep. I don't know. And so people are like in this heavily censored, surveilled world. People may be wearing facial devices and wearing certain sort of asymmetrical clothing and things. Anything that throws off systems of recognition, which forces you to sort of, the only way then you can work is to become more human again and be like, okay, I'll take my mask off if you take yours off, kind of thing. And then we'll see each other for real. So I think it makes for a very interesting future. And of course, we're trying to limit the bad side of things, of course. So
Absolutely.
I mean, that's part on everyone in this industry to try and do that. And I know a lot of people care deeply about this stuff.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people in the industry face every day. Like, what are the ramifications of this? And I think that's a responsibility that everyone who works in XR should really keep in the back of the mind. What is the societal impact? Is this good for our future? Speaking of the future, you've switched gears from working at Amazon and Google, focused on XR, but now working as a startup as a head of UX at Bootloader. Tell me about Bootloader and how you're redefining human-computer interaction. What are you doing there?
I mean, I obviously I can't go into like all the detail at this point because we're still technically in stealth mode. But what I can tell you is the kind of origin story of it and how I got involved. I just left Amazon earlier this year, the start of the year, and a good friend of mine, a CEO of a company that I started in Vancouver, Proxy, which is an electrical wearable company. He said to me, "Hey, there's this. You want to meet this guy? He's interested in talking to leaders in AR and VR and so on." There wasn't a lot of like context, to be honest, but he said he's really intriguing. You need to meet him, the CEO. So I met him, and obviously I've been attracted to crazy CEOs from the past, like at Meta, and I'm a passionate CEOs, like people who really, really have that kind of vision. And I'm also really, really attracted to things that are not sort of typical and safe as well. So I met with Brian Pells, who's the CEO of Bootloader. And so he pitches me. We talk a bit. He talks about the book that I wrote, talks about my history and, Google and so on. And then he pitches the idea of what Bootloader is trying to do, which was nothing like what I'd originally been thinking it was going to be. And initially my reaction was kind of like, that is really different. I couldn't place it to anything that I'd done before. I couldn't really place it to anything that I knew other people were doing, but it was tangentially linked to AI. So the common theme there was artificial intelligence. And, just to be clear, the thing that attracted me is it wasn't OpenAI or ChatGPT. It was not a call and response system of AI. It wasn't meant to be like, ask me questions and I shall give you answers. So that was where I was like, what is it? And it was about emotion. And so really the idea is of effective AI. And this is an area that actually it's not as explored as obviously the hotter area of, ChatGPT and building services around it. But then when you combine that with mixed reality, augmented reality, you have the potential for new forms of being. And it was something that I initially I was like, I don't even know where to start with it. And then through further conversation and realizing that we, not only was Brian the CEO, but my colleague Mark Drummond had joined. And Mark was the head of AI at Apple. And so he left Apple on the day of the Vision Pro announcement. And he'd been working on that, and he joined Bootloader. So it was like, okay, we are very legitimized right now. We are really, really, doing something. You might hear my dog barking in the background. Hopefully not. Oh, that's good.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, so anyway,
my dog barks all the time.
He joined Bootloader as well, and that gave me a sense of, okay, this is legitimate. It's an area that Apple has looked at. It's an area that I think is brand spanking new. And of course, it's only going to make sense when you have it in mixed reality. It's only going to be able to manifest correctly in mixed reality, at least, to understand the kind of emotive and effective aspects of AI that we are working on. And so the company is actually based in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. It's an American company. Brian is from the Bay Area, actually. Lived in Napa for a long time. And basically we have a small team. Design and AI is here on the West Coast of the US. A lot of the kind of 3D work is done in Vietnam. They have a lot of game developers and so on to do the kind of meat and bones of the building blocks of using Unity and Unreal and so on. And Polyspatial we use, and obviously we use the tools from Apple themselves, because we are definitely looking at targeting the Apple Vision Pro. So yeah, it's been a wild ride, and it honestly, Dave, it's something that I have never done in this way before. It's genuinely new. And so the challenge is vast, but the people are awesome, and a lot of the passion is there. And that's what I missed about the big company as well. is in startups. You get a lot of very driven, passion-filled people who want to change the world. And I missed a bit of that. And also, I missed just being close with people and like working on things together. So I was just in Vietnam a couple of weeks ago for a couple of weeks. I'll be going back again in probably late November. And so, and then some of them come over, of course, to the West Coast as well. But it works out really well. I have devices here, and I do my stuff from the Mojave Desert, working with future type of AI for a future medium. I couldn't have imagined I would be doing this.
Wow, that sounds very mysterious, but sounds very cool, Kharis. I want to know more. Since you mentioned it, Apple Vision Pro, thoughts. I mean, that came out. A lot of things that we were doing at the original Meta, we were actually, I don't know if you had the same experience, but looking at the big announcement, I was like, this seems so familiar. Tell me about your thoughts on the Apple Vision Pro.
It didn't come as a surprise. I knew it was coming. We've got to remember back in the day at Meta, we worked with Apple on a few things because we were obviously, one of the pioneers in the space. We had the knowledge and had the experience. And so it made sense, obviously, the connection as well with Mike Rockwell from Apple and Meta as well. So it's interesting with that context to then jump to the Apple Vision Pro announcement. And there's a couple of things happened on the announcement day. Number one was I got a call from a colleague who shall remain nameless, who's a very senior level at Meta, as in like Facebook Meta, who called me on the day and said, I am so sorry, we never listened to you. And that, you were right. Like I said earlier in this thing, in this interview, I said Apple would do something more immersive, and I was told, no, they won't. They will never do that at Google. And then, as it turns out, those people went on to Facebook, and then they were apologizing. So that was the first weird thing of the day, was like, it's all coming back. It's like, it's all coming back. There was a lot of like the interface attributes that we'd had at Meta as well, with the floating screens and the interaction. So there was a lot of similarities. But the one thing, of course, that I was, or the two things I'm happy about, but the big one was, thank God it's over. It's like, finally, the one company that everyone has speculated, will they, won't they, yada, 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 has finally been like, yes, we are, here it is. And so it's kind of like, now we can just stop speculating on Apple and what if Apple enters? So I think that was, at the minimum, was great. And then, obviously, looking at the hardware and the detail that they put in to the hardware, it's a set of compromises. I get it. They're obviously having to lean in initially to more of like, the iPad traditional UI to make sure there's a value there. I think that it will be second to none integration with the rest of your Apple products, because that's a huge problem, and as always has been, even from the Meta days where you needed to boot it up special with a special PC and it didn't interface with things. Still an issue with Meta today, where it's still largely a standalone device. It doesn't really integrate in any meaningful way or in any kind of smooth way with, the UX is terrible. With the other devices in my life, obviously with Apple, it's just going to work. So that is in itself, they've solved a huge burden of adoption, because, and actually, believe it or not, that was part of our plan at Google, was like, hey, we own the like soup to nuts ecosystem of this, so surely we can build the whole thing to work seamlessly together. Yeah, exactly. So
conceptually, rest in peace, Stadia.
Yes, but I think Apple will nail that, and they have nailed that. I think Apple has a lot of draw, so I think it will pull people in who maybe never would have even considered the medium before. So I think that's great. I think it legitimizes, of course, a lot of the startups that have been struggling in the space. I think it's going to open up much more investment in the space, even though it's not going to be, an iPhone rags to riches story. Apple knows this is a long haul. It always is. If you think about the time from the Apple One, with Jobs and Wozniak showing it off, as the wooden box with the board in and the monitor, all the way up to the kind of Macintosh launches. That was a long time. So it's going to be similar for us now. Apple will introduce it. It'll gain some buzz. It will get traction. It's an amazingly built device. No expense spared. That's why it's expensive. And I think they've done what they've had to do this at this stage. But is this the final form? No. Is this going to be the thing that people are going to wear walking around? No. Maybe some might do in the Bay Area. Hope not. We don't get the glass hole situation that we had with Google back in the day. But anyway, assuming that it isn't going to be the thing that mum and dad are going to be wearing walking around, I think that this is a journey now that Apple will keep investing in, because Apple's been doing it a long time behind the scenes now, a long time, and so they to reveal this now is more like it's the end of the beginning for them. It's not the beginning of the end. So it's like, okay, now we can actually start like talking more openly and getting more people involved and so on. And I think that was awesome about the launch. It was finally, like I said, I was just like, oh, here it is. Finally, it's over. I know more.
Right. Yeah. And there's a timeline now where consumer adoption happens, right?
Exactly.
I think we're waiting for that moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it will sell. It will definitely, people will buy them. I think that it will serve as a thing that just helps expose other people to trying it out. I think a lot of people early adopters will buy it, and obviously prosumers that have got the $4,000 in their bank account they want to spend, they'll buy them. But the important thing is not that; it's who it gets exposed to. You put it on people's faces, and they get to see it, and they're like, "Oh, I never realized this is the future, isn't it?" And then that's as it starts to grow, so that as the devices get cheaper, obviously more plentiful, start to come down in price. Then those people are already prepped. They're all ready to go. They're like, take my money. Now it's only, $2,000 or, $1,500. Sure, I'll do it. It's like a new iPhone. So I think that's when you get this kind of Cambrian explosion of adoption. But for now, we're still in that, we've just got over the kind of initialization stages, which for us is weird because we've been in this place for so long. It's weird to think, finally it's starting. And it's like, wait, how many years is this?
We've been, invested a decade in this thing.
So for me, it's kind of weird because you feel
fantastic.
old and a bit like a veteran. And you don't want to be necessarily. You still want to have that innocence and excitement. And you're like, this is it. But I think that one thing that people like, yourself and myself can bring is just some of that kind of down to earth context of these things have been tried before. A lot of these things are not net new ideas. They've just been more polished and more executed with a lot more time to bake. And I think that's always the risk of the early adopters and the pioneers, is that they come out the door with guns blazing, and sometimes, you just get shot to pieces, and it's like, that's the way it is. But I think that there's a bright future now. Maybe there wasn't 2 years ago, there maybe with the space, but I think that the tide has turned again. I just hope that it stays turned.
Yeah. Well, I think the excitement's still there. It's just a matter of, I think, the content that they're going to release. I think there's going to be more hands-on experiences that people will be sharing. I mean, I think one thing that they've got right is that form factor that Apple does really well. It's still a dev kit, but they needed to get eye tracking working with your hand input. They needed to make it really natural. What are some of your predictions in the next, let's say, 1 year time frame to 3 year time frame for XR
So I
today?
think they'll have the launch event next year when it hits the streets, and when all the NDAs are removed. Everyone will get real. I think it will be a little bit of a divider in the industry. I'm going to say there will be the new school that's all in on the Apple approach and is like, they've got the right way with privacy, security, and all those things. There will be arguably the OG side of VR and AR that will be a little bit screwing because it's like, not fully VR, not really going full in on gaming yet. And there'll be a little bit of like, is Apple really one of us, or are they doing their usual thing of like going it alone? And I think that, classic Apple, they can just go it alone. They don't care whether you follow or not. They're just going to do their thing. But I think what it will do is it will create a catalyzation next year of new products coming out on the Vision Pro. I think we're going to see, like ourselves at Bootloader, a whole new category of experiences that arguably would not work so well on other devices because they lack the certain sensors or the certain resolution of the sensors that are on the Vision Pro. So there's a bar that's kind of been set. So I think a bunch of people will jump there. I think that people start to jump ship next year, start to port their VR things over as they see the kind of groundswell of interest. And then what's going to happen, I think, is, come 2024, 25, Apple will release a new, cheaper version of the headset, whether it's Vision Pro or Vision or whatever it is, to kind of bring the experience access down a little bit so it can go a little bit broader as well. Because obviously as you bring it down, it can go a bit broader, start to become a slightly more mainstream. And I can actually imagine that by 2024, the Apple ads on TV that are famous will all be like the Vision Pro. Before it was kids, hipsters rolling around on their bed with their iPhones, it's going to be cool looking glasses, cool clothes, going out on a night in the town, things popping up. And that is when everyone will be like, oh my God, I have to have this now. This is it. It's happening. And I think that is maybe 2 to 3 years, you'll start to hit just that tipping point where maybe payment plans for buying the device will be really there. So it won't be a big hit out the box. A bit like early mobile days, right? All the costs were hidden. Otherwise, people would never have bought phones back then. And I think that once those costs get hidden in those Apple Pay payments, then I think the kids will start lining. I know my son is already asking me, and I'm like, absolutely out of the question. You are not Christmas. But, as time goes forward, as we all know, this will start to change. And then I imagine, just like with the smartphones of the past, some platforms won't make it. You can only, people can only support so many platforms. People only will own one device. They're not going to be swapping headsets around because they want to play a game and then they're going to do this. So people will start to make that hard cut like iOS, Android, and then build their ecosystems based off the platform. That means I don't know what will happen with the outliers like HTC or Samsung or whoever. I think for Meta, it may end up where they're the only surviving equivalent for iOS because they've invested so much already. So I can imagine an iOS Meta, which funny enough runs on Android, iOS Meta hegemony of like, oh, you're either with these guys who are more like cheap and loads of gaming and you can give the headset away for Christmas because it's cheap, like a Nintendo kind of approach, versus, Apple still is the high end, the brushed aluminum, the kind of like,
luxury item.
That's for the serious people. And, that's really the expensive stuff for the pros. And I think that is probably what will happen. And a lot of the smaller, probably companies will either shut down or move to just like making software that runs on any of these devices. So, that's kind of my prediction with it. Of course, hopefully we don't have a Google Glass moment, number 2. People turn against it.
A-poles.
And I go like, my date came out and met me and they were wearing an Apple Vision Pro and it was creepy and he wouldn't take it off. And it's like, whoa. Let's hope we've learned from the Vision.
Yeah. We mentioned a couple of those features that Apple Vision Pro has in terms of eye tracking, hand tracking. What advice do you give for aspiring designers going into user experience for mixed reality now with some of these new features that are coming out with some of these new headsets? What advice
Well,
do
I
you
mean,
give them
eye
for that?
tracking is a very, very powerful control method, but also insight method that can be abused, of course. It's almost the holy grail for advertisements because, of course, it's all about clicks and eyes on and what you can charge for. Apple has taken a very, very privacy first stance, so they don't expose the eye tracking data to any third party. So that means that for advertisers, they're kind of SOL because it's like, no idea if they looked at our advert or not. There's no data being shared from Apple. But for the principles that Apple is using it for, I think it's really good. Like the idea of the gaze and pinch as a trigger mechanism is good. I know at Google we tried to do gaze and then triggering it just from gaze. The problem with that as a designer is that it makes people nervous at looking at things because they don't know if it's going to trigger, and that makes me anxious. So the idea of the confirmation with the click, so there's a kind of, a relief. Yeah,
Double
you
feedback.
need that to make sure that I can look at anything, and it's not like suddenly something is going to happen and I don't know why it happened. So
Right.
I think the eye tracking
Yeah.
system there is really useful. I also think that eye tracking should eventually be available to third parties for their own use to understand how people are using their application. There's a company out of Vancouver, actually, Canada, that I worked with years ago called Cognitive VR, I think it was called. And they were doing like heat maps of like what you're looking at in a game so that you could understand
That's right. I
like
remember those
how to better
guys.
design your
Yeah.
game, right, for the customer. So I
Yeah.
think that if Apple starts allowing some of the data that's anonymized to be useful, then it will help people design better applications, less wasteful. And then, the rest of it is the hand interactions. Obviously, you've got the gaze and click for traditional sort of interfaces, but Apple still has full like hand tracking for immersive experiences in the Vision Pro. So it will allow you to use gestures or use direct manipulation. They have a bunch of like human interface guidelines, as you'd expect, just like we had at Meta, again, the overlap, that were very similar in like, do this, don't do that. So I think, a lot of them are principally useful for designers. I think it's any designers who have not been in the space, go grab the user interface guidelines for the Vision Pro from apple.com, read through it and really try to understand the interaction and the context of the interaction is really, really important. And that's the difference between this medium and prior mediums. Where again, you didn't really need to care about the environment that a phone was being used in. As long as you got a phone, it's got a screen, you can click it. But I think that it's exciting for designers with the emerging tools as well, like Shapes VR and XR and others. I think that is going to start to become the standard, and maybe even in design schools. In the future, all the kids will be sitting there with headsets on, doing this. You're like, what is the world have we
Well, I'm more of an optimist. I feel good about that future, but I think all of those things that we mentioned during the show,
Yeah.
we should just be mindful of. Kharis, I had such a great time. Where can people
Yeah,
find you?
so I mean, I used to do a lot more talks. I'm going to start doing more talks again. This is definitely, like with you, David, is the first thing I've done in a long time, especially because at Google and Amazon, they were not keen on talking with anyone. But now with Bootloader, I'm a bit freer. So I'm always up for like speaking at conferences and forums like I used to in the past. I can be found at my website, which is the Foog space. So the Foog dot space is my website that contains just examples, and it also has some links to my music as well, because my other side of my life is being an electronic musician as well. So I mean, I'm kind of all over the place. My name is, one thing I've always been told is having a name like mine means I can't hide on the internet. So all you have to do is put my name in, and you'll get like 3 pages of like nothing but me from Google. And so I can't really hide. But yeah, I feel free to contact me through my website, or if you want to talk more about this space, I can talk for a long time, as you can imagine, about all this stuff.
It was fascinating. Kharis, I had such a wonderful time. I want to maybe do another show with you. We could talk more about your music. I told you that I wanted to delve deep into that, but we didn't have time. But Kharis, thank you so much, man.
Pleasure, David. It's been awesome chatting with you again.
Fantastic.
Those meta vibes, they're still there.
We're gonna do it again soon. There's gonna be a reunion. That just mark my
Awesome.
words. Cool.